Mr. Affleck.
Chairman McKeon, Congressman Smith, distinguished members of the Armed Services Committee, on behalf of the Eastern Congo Initiative, I want to first thank you for holding this hearing and devoting your time and attention to the ongoing crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo. My name is Ben Affleck. I am the founder of the Eastern Congo Initiative. We are the only U.S.-based grant-making and advocacy organization entirely focused on working with and for the people of Eastern Congo, a region that has the unwanted distinction of being one of the most volatile in the world and the site of the deadliest conflict since World War II. From the outset, let me say that I am not here to ask for American tax dollars. I am here today to respectfully request that you use the most important power you have, your collective voice as representatives of the United States of America. From 1998 to 2003, 8 African nations fought on Congolese soil, causing the deaths of millions, forcing tens of thousands of children to become child soldiers, and, in some areas of Congo, subjecting as many as 2 of every 3 women to rape and other forms of sexual violence. The United Nations estimates that as many as 900,000 Congolese have been newly displaced in the North Kivu province since fighting reignited early this year. As you know, just a few weeks ago in Goma, the economic center and capital of North Kivu province was temporarily controlled by the newly formed M23 militia, injuring hundreds, displacing tens of thousands. M23 is just the latest in a long list of armed groups who have destabilized Congo since 1994. With the latest violence, the world is reminded that the systemic sources of instability in this region have yet to be addressed. Still, in the face of this violence and suffering, the people of Eastern Congo remain committed to helping their neighbors and rebuilding their communities. ECI staff and our partners have continued to work throughout the crisis, not only providing humanitarian assistance, but continuing important development activities focused on a brighter future. When heavy shelling began last month near our office in Goma, the surgeons, doctors, and nurses of ECI's partner, Heal Africa, rushed to the hospital, anticipating increased numbers of wounded in what is already an overcrowded hospital. Many of these same caregivers were still at the hospital 5 days later, providing free treatment to numerous civilians wounded in the conflict. Another ECI partner, Mutani FM, continued to broadcast news throughout the crisis. Mutani, the only independent radio station in Goma, is located across the street from the Congolese Army headquarters, which was seized and occupied by M23 during the height of the conflict. Despite the odds, these brave journalists, all young adults in their 20s, stayed on the airwaves, either reporting from the front lines or locked safely inside the radio station, reporting on the fighting as it spread across the region. Every day, I am inspired by the resilience and the determination of the Congolese, who desperately want to live their lives in peace, earn a decent living, and raise their families just like the rest of us. Mr. Chairman, they deserve better than the cycle of violence and upheaval that continues to undermine their daily work of rebuilding this war-torn community. While the M23 has withdrawn from Goma, they have not disbanded. In fact, as of this morning, our team on the ground tells us they are just 4 miles away from the city center, and there are fears that they may attack Goma again. We have seen this cycle repeat itself too many times. Violence flares up, and the international community turns its attention for a moment to this part of the world. Violence recedes, and the world turns away in relief, without addressing the systemic issues that must be dealt with in order for lasting peace to be established and maintained. Since my very first visit to Congo in 2006, it is clear to me that the pursuit of durable peace in Congo is not hopeless. Quite the contrary, in fact. The solutions are not new, nor are they particularly complex. But without persistent high leadership by the United States, the key players will not come to the table and will not do their part. First, let's set aside the notion that the recent talks in Kampala will end the cycle of violence. Last week's negotiations were not even attended by the region's key players. It's for this reason that ECI has called on the UN Secretary General to appoint a special envoy under the joint auspices of the UN and the African Union to bring all stakeholders together to craft real, implementable solutions. We are delighted that Assistant Secretary Johnny Carson announced the State Department's support for this idea in his recent testimony. For 15 years, the United Nations has run a peacekeeping mission in Congo. The time has come to fundamentally reconsider its mandate. As M23 moved into Goma, the 17,000 troops deployed across DRC that make up the United Nations Stabilization Mission, known as MONUSCO, did not protect civilians in harm's way. This failure raises serious concerns. That said, the larger failure most certainly lies with the DRC's own security forces, continued inability to protect their citizens. With focused U.S. leadership, the UN mandate should reflect the needs of the country, and the DRC security sector must be reformed. Last week, we were delighted that the UN Secretary General launched a review of MONUSCO's mission. We hope that the United States will take the lead in the Security Council, supporting significant changes to MONUSCO's mandate. At a minimum, the mandate must be strengthened to enable whatever force remains to actually keep the peace and protect the people. We also believe the UN's mandate in Congo should not be indefinite. An open-ended mandate undermines the urgency for the Congolese government to take responsibility for protecting their own citizens. Looking beyond the United Nations, donor countries have enormous leverage in the region, which they should exert to bring key regional players together for serious negotiations. International donors can play a more active role in preventing violence from returning. And, of course, Congo's neighbors play a critical role in regional security. There will be no lasting stability without their leadership. The United Nations has been presented with evidence that M23 is sustained by significant outside support from Rwanda and Uganda. If these accusations are true, any support must end. Congo's neighbors have legitimate security concerns, and their national economies greatly benefit from DRC's national resources. We hope the presidents of Rwanda and Uganda will engage in serious discussions about the many issues that affect regional stability. The Obama administration can and should leverage its unique relationship with these leaders to insist they pursue resolutions directly with the government in Congo rather than indirectly through the support of armed militias. It is not enough for the M23 to withdraw from Goma. Until the militia is disbanded, the people of Eastern Congo will live with the daily threat of violence. To be clear, eliminating M23 alone will not restore peace. Just the last time I was in Congo in February, there were at least 27 armed groups operating in the eastern provinces. The regional aspects of this conflict include failures in Kinshasa. Since the last ceasefire in 2006, too little has changed inside Congo. Kinshasa must take seriously its lack of legitimacy in many parts of Congo and act now to address the grievances of its people. When Goma fell to M23, there were spontaneous riots in Bukavu, Kisangani, and Kinshasa, aimed not only at militia violence, but also at the failure of President Kabila's government to protect its citizens. To restore legitimacy, the Independent National Electoral Commission should immediately set a date for and begin to organize the provincial elections that were supposed to take place in March of this year. The Electoral Commission itself has been seen by opposition parties and international election observers as an obstacle to political legitimacy. It must be reformed. President Kabila must also commit to the overdue reform of Congo's security sector. This is critical. Without competent military and law enforcement institutions, Congo's territory will continue to provide safe haven to armed groups who prey on civilians and disrupt economic development. In April of this year, ECI helped lead an effort alongside nearly 300 Congolese civil society organizations to publish a comprehensive report about the need for security sector reform in Congo. This report, which I asked to be submitted for the record, calls for an end to the conflict through a comprehensive reform of security institutions, which include the military, law enforcement, such as police, and the courts. President Kabila has expressed an interest in SSR, but it has not been a priority of his administration. It must become a priority now, and the U.S. has an important role to play in ensuring that this happens. Mr. Chairman, I realize we're laying out a very broad agenda, but we know that none of this, not the revised MONUSCO mandate, the increased donor involvement, the responsible behavior of DRC's neighbors, or internal DRC reforms, will happen without direct, high-level, focused U.S. leadership. President Obama and many of you have unique leverage with key international and regional stakeholders, and the United States is held in very high regard by the Congolese people. Your leadership can make a difference if we act decisively, and do so today. This is why ECI has called on the President to appoint a temporary special envoy to signal clearly that finding a lasting solution to the crisis in Central Africa is a priority for his administration. Past models for this approach, including Senator John Kerry to Sudan, the late veteran diplomat Richard Holbrooke on the Balkans, or General Colin Powell to Haiti, demonstrate that high-level diplomatic intervention at the right moment can cut through deadly impasses and open the way toward peace and lasting stability. At the United Nations, the new presidential envoy should work with the Secretary General to establish a timetable for regional negotiations, revise MONUSCO's mandate, and draw up a strategy for reinstating a ceasefire in case violence flares up again. Internationally, the U.S. should encourage our NATO allies and other key partners to provide police, judicial, and military training so that the Congolese government can increase its capacity to protect its own people as MONUSCO's mandate winds down. U.S. Africa Command's AFRICOM work with the Congolese Army has demonstrated that a little training can have a big impact. During the most recent crisis, ECI staff in Goma got a car stuck in a ditch. Happens a lot, unfortunately. A truck full of Congolese soldiers pulled up and offered to help. To be honest, our staff wasn't sure what to expect. In the past, this kind of help would most likely have been accompanied by a request for a bribe. In this case, the soldiers brought the car out of the ditch and simply waved goodbye. It turns out they were part of the unit that AFRICOM trained in 2010. The successful AFRICOM training mission is only the latest example in the 52 years since Congo's independence of the close U.S.-Congolese ties. As a major donor of humanitarian and other assistance, our country has much more influence in Kinshasa than we have been willing to exert. The President's envoy should engage directly with President Kabila to accept assistance in developing a strategy for implementing comprehensive security sector reform. With an agreed-upon deadline in place for announcing the SSR strategy, the U.S. should step in to provide Congo with whatever technical support it needs, in partnership with the EU, NATO, and others, to complete planning. AFRICOM's, I'm rushing to try to get through the 5 minutes, which I think I passed about 15 minutes ago. AFRICOM's plan to train a second unit of the FARDC should be put on hold until provincial elections are organized and President Kabila produces and commits to a workable plan for implementing comprehensive security sector reform. But once that commitment is clear, Congo will need and deserves international support to ensure that reform takes hold. Mr. Chairman, I know that Congress and the Armed Services Committee in particular hears more urgent requests for U.S. leadership in the world than can be answered. Resolving the cycle of violence does not necessarily require a significant new financial investment by the United States or U.S. boots on the ground. It does, however, require American political leadership, moral leadership even, to bring the parties together to address the larger sources of instability in the region. I may be naive, but I believe that our actions in foreign policy represent our values as a country. They represent who we are as a people. Soon I'll be making my 10th trip to Congo, and I know that if your constituents were to go to Congo and see what's happening there, they too would insist that we do something about it. I founded ECI in part to serve as a megaphone, to amplify the voices of the people of Eastern Congo, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to do that today. In fact, it's an honor. Even in the face of violence and upheaval, the Congolese remain resilient and entirely determined to rebuild their country. The 70 million Congolese deserve a better tomorrow, and they haven't given up trying to build a better future. With support from Congress and leadership from the President, the United States can help them get there. We can help, and we should. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. You brought up a point that always bothers me about these hearings. We bring in experts, give them 5 minutes to tell us everything they know about it, and then we're supposed to absorb all of that and make policy. I'd prefer sitting around a coffee table and discussing it to get really to the point of the matter. But it is what it is, and we'll deal with it. You all are very, very familiar with the situation. I, frankly, knew nothing about the Congo other than what I've learned here today. It's not an area of the world that we've focused on. We have a war in Afghanistan. We just completed a war in Iraq. We're looking at other very serious threats around the world, and that's kind of where my focus has been. So I really thank Adam for bringing this to our attention and for encouraging us to hold this hearing, because I think it's been a real eye-opener to me. I was in a meeting the other day when it was brought up by a member about the seriousness of Syria. And in a year, we've had 40,000 people killed there. And that's something that the whole world is focused on. And yet I come here today and learn that we've lost 5 million people in the Congo, and I didn't know about it until right now. it's amazing what we know and what we don't know. Having said that, and having listened to this testimony and understanding that we're spending $480 million roughly a year in this area, you've all been there, you understand it. Are we spending it the way we should? What, if you were king for a day, or queen, what would you say we're able to keep spending that money? We have sequestration that's hitting us. We're cutting $1 trillion out of defense over the next 10 years if all this goes through. You've already heard the stories of how much we're cutting back our military and our ability to carry out our missions. But assuming we could keep spending that same money there, what would you do with that money, each of you?
First of all, I'm not sure that sequestration is going to hit. We have to plan for success, I think, and my answers will reflect the assumption that that doesn't take place. There are a number of things I would do, but if I was could wave a magic wand. But speaking in practical terms, the mandate needs to be completely re-examined. Even if you talk to people within the United Nations, they talk about MONUSCO being a failure. You go to Congo and you talk to Congolese civilians, and they've got an anger and a resentment toward people from the United Nations that you can't believe. They're spending $1 billion plus total down there trying to help people, and they deeply resent it. And the reason they deeply resent it is because their mandate is to protect civilians, but when trouble breaks out, they're hiding in barracks, or they're avoiding these confrontations, or they're allowing militias like M23, which is the size of half a battalion in the United States military, to run roughshod and take over the city. So civilians are not being protected. The mandate is deeply flawed. The leadership probably needs to be re-examined. I think that I would, in a very broad sense, look at making sure that we are protecting civilians and making sure that we are using the leverage that we have through MONUSCO. As you say, we're spending over $400 million, a year, that we get our money's worth from the American taxpayer. Then we need to ask for better. It's a noble and valiant mission. It's a place where people are suffering, and we can do better. And one of the ways that we can do better is try to expand upon some of the training that they're doing there, trying to address this issue of soldiers getting paid, which is one of the real problems down there, is that nobody gets paid. Their salary is $40 a month, and they're not even getting that. And there is a culture handed down since Mobutu that says, well, don't worry about getting paid. You're really going to live off the population. And that's what's given rise to FIRDC being responsible for more than 40% of the gender-based violence in that country. As you can see, it's quite a web. But I think we have a lot of levers for sure at the UN, and we ought to be examining those right away.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the first thing to do is to get the policy or the diplomatic framework correct. And by that, I mean that without spending any money, really, if the administration would put in place the type of bilateral commissions in which they can then focus the Congolese government's attention on security sector reform and raise the priority and the attention of the Congolese government, that would go very far without really costing anything more than plane tickets. So that's the first thing, is really focus on the diplomatic framework in which this relationship is happening. Right now, it's extremely weak. It was much stronger during the last administration through mechanisms that were put in place, like the tripartite plus process and joint planning cells. Secondly, I think that Ben is exactly right. The MONUSCO mandate is problematic, but we've strengthened it over many, many years. We're spending $1.5 billion. That mission costs $1.5 billion. And it's not obviously having the effect that we want. I would really focus on training both the Congolese battalion that we talked about, but this international neutral force, which is really African forces. And we've done this before. We did it, we're doing it successfully in Amazon, which is mainly Ugandans and Burundians who have really stabilized Mogadishu and are playing a very positive role in Somalia. We did it very effectively in Liberia when we first had African forces on the ground, and then they transitioned to Blue Helmet. In this case, we have a Blue Helmet force already, but I would say that if we could train up and work with regional forces and the Southern African Development Community, namely South Africa, Tanzania, and maybe Angola, have said they would put forces. So plan with them, work with them, and they may not need equipment and they may not even need movement because they actually have that capacity within their armies, but the planning side, work very closely with them, bring them in as maybe part of MONUSCO's mandate, maybe not. I think that that's for the administration to work out, but get a real strike force that can have some real capability on the ground. And African forces are increasingly showing both the responsibility as well as the capacity to do this type of mission. And this is a planning mission. This is not U.S. boots, you know, getting into offensive operations. So that would be the second. Thirdly, I would say that really we're not spending very much on the type of issues as my colleague here said on the IMET, the International Military Education Training. We're spending less than $500,000. It's about $450,000, which is on military justice, on human rights training, and other types of professionalization and changing the ethos of the Congolese army. I think that, you know, $500,000 really is not going to hurt anybody. It's that those numbers are actually decreasing. We probably should sustain that level, if not increase it slightly. But I don't want to ask for money in a certain environment, but certainly we shouldn't be decreasing, or we really need to put a focus on that type of professionalization and training of the Congolese army. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think we all agree that we could have different solutions, but we all agree that the security force that it's now, it's not adequate. So we're not getting the return on investment. I think that's very clear. And I would put that as number one. I certainly think spending a lot more money is not going to make a lot of difference. It's the largest country in Africa. It's the 19th largest country in the world, most populous country in the world. So, but we can get much, much more efficiency for what we have. So the one area where I might differ a little is this notion of I think top-down reform, particularly in the security sector. I just not very optimistic about that at all. I do think the key has to really be empowering at the provincial level. So I think the provincial level are very important. But I honestly, I mean, you know, we can build all the Potemkin battalions we want. In a country in this size, you know, we've got to have capacity at the local level. And I think we have to go from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Carafano, in your opening remarks, said a couple of things that are very near and dear to my heart, talking about the Somalia model and how this is really sort of, you know, building capacity of local partners, and it's a light footprint approach to yield huge results. I think that's the direction that our foreign policy needs to go, and it's a partnership between DOD, state, and also we need to really improve on the development and economic piece as well, so that we're not spending a lot of money and we're not putting, you know, U.S. lives at risk. Both that saves us money. It's also, as you just said in your last remarks, they're much more effective. You build the local capacity. We can't simply show up and say, we're here, we're going to fix your problems. That doesn't work. It's got to be capacity building. It's got to be locally driven. And I think Somalia is an excellent model. We worked with Ethiopia, Uganda, Burundi, and Kenya, and, you know, we've had success by Somalia measures at any rate, based on their efforts in that country in a very light footprint. And the partnership there has also helped us in Yemen. You look at what we invested in Iraq and Afghanistan versus the result of what we invested in dealing with the Horn of Africa problem and what resulted, and you see the wisdom of this approach. And definitely think we need to move in that direction and think the DRC is a very important place to do that. Has to be locally driven. That said, I want to explore a little bit on the training of the battalion issue. That kind of is locally driven. You know, light footprint, we're trained their military to get better at security, and it seems to me that none of this is going to happen unless we figure out how to do it. I think the U.S. has to play a role. So 2 questions about that. Do you think it makes sense to look for opportunities to train more battalions, to use that light footprint, to build the DRC capacity? And then second, the thing that would be really helpful, that is very tough in the Eastern Congo, is to get that support from those countries I just mentioned who gave us support in Somalia. And also Angola could play a role in this too. There's a lot of painful history with all of those countries in the Eastern Congo. Do you think we can overcome that, and that those countries can be a useful part of sort of flopping that Horn of Africa model over onto the Eastern DRC? How do we build that vision?
Let me answer the second part of that question first, which is, I'm a strategist. So for strategists, the right answer is the right answer, right? There's no such thing as a universal model that works everywhere. On the other hand,
Absolutely.
I would say that this region is primed for something that looks like the Somalia model, recognizing all the difficulties involved. The payoff here, I think, is enormous. And I think it is the quintessential piece. To go back to the first question, I'm just very skeptical about security sector reform in a country that is thoroughly corrupt, where the government is widely perceived as illegitimate, and where you don't have the infrastructure and you have this enormous army. So these little tiny battalions, I'm sure, are wonderful little models, but it's the 19th most populous country in the world, and the Eastern Congo is a huge region. So I think if you want to get something in there and then stabilizes that, I think the Somalia model is a very worthy and important first step that stems the bleeding. And then I think this is in the DRC. I mean, you're not going to see this dramatic reform from the top down anytime in the near future. We really have to look at models in the countryside at the provincial level, empowering the provincial officials to look after this. Now, you can find bad examples of these things. If you don't do it right, you can have warlordism, right? And and the country can devolve into civil war. If you're just throwing money and weapons at people.
Yeah, I think we're already there.
Right.
DRC,
so the key is
backwards.
actually something really you mentioned, and something where the United States has learned an awful lot of very good lessons, and that is to look at these things in a more holistic way, to do the kind of security development and economic development and civil society development. And there's no perfect model for this, but again, side by side in tandem, and keep these things in mind, and they do provide enduring solutions.
Yeah, but absolutely, I think we have resources that can do that. And Mr. Affleck, I wanted to ask if you could sort of put a positive piece on this, because I know in working with the Eastern Congo Initiative before, there are a lot of positive things going on in the Eastern DRC in terms of economic development, in terms of groups. I was over there, visited with Heal Africa, a group I know you support, that's trying to combat the institutionalized rape that happens there. There is economic development happening, which I know you guys have been focused on. Because I think, some people paint the picture and go, this is hopeless, nothing can be done there, but that's really not the case. Talk a little bit about some of the positive stuff that is going on even now in the DRC.
Sure. At ECI, we really see the country through the prism of the people that we meet on the ground. And I agree with you that, there is necessarily needs to be an effort from the ground up to reform some of these larger institutions. I also believe that the top-down reform is necessary as well. But when I think about Congo, when I look at Congo, I don't think about, all the dead and all the sexual, the gender-based violence, all the terrible things you hear. 1 in 5 children die before the age of 5 years old. That misery, that suffering is real. Just as real is a tremendous and indomitable spirit that you see from Congolese people, that we see with so many of our grantees who are teaching, who are building capacity with former child soldiers to help them find work in the economy, from people who are struggling mightily and oftentimes in the face of literal warfare to keep their country together. Not just to keep their country together, but to build their country. And so I have to reject on a very basic level this sort of pervasive notion of hopelessness that exists. It becomes sort of fashionable to say, like in a larger sense, the continent of Africa, oh, well, hopeless, corrupt, problematic, can't fix it. Not true. Not true in Africa, not true in Congo, not true in Eastern Congo, because I've seen advancements. And I do believe that there's, necessarily a kind of incrementalism that has to be part of one's approach, that yes, that these battalions are rather small, and right now they're just emblematic of what could happen. But it can, in fact, happen, because I've seen other similar progress take place, and I've seen it engineered, conceived, and driven by people who live there, which makes sense if you think about it. The people who are best equipped to rebuild their neighborhood are the people who live there. And so when I think about that, and when I think about the hopefulness that I've seen, then I do believe that it's possible to, for example, we're funding through the Panzi Hospital in South Kivu, women's organization for sort of to pursue legal solutions to having been raped. We see that some of the police force can, in fact, be can in fact be improved. And we take these signs, albeit small measurements, and we assume that if it can be done in this minor way, it can be done on a larger scope. Will it be easy? No. Are they simple solutions? No. But I know for a fact, from having been on the ground, from having seen the people there who have a tremendous desire to work, and many of whom who are educated, many of whom who understand and reject the corruption in their own country. It's not a pervasive thing where all Congolese are corrupt. As you all know, we fostered and supported a corrupt guy named Mobutu during the Cold War because he was for national security reasons, and that inculcated a culture of corruption within the sort of official government level. But people in that country don't want that. They reject it. And if people show up and say, let us partner with you in trying to rid your country of this, I think you'll find that the people of Congo will be extremely receptive and not just willing, but active partners.
Right. Thank you very much. It is, one of the most rich countries in minerals and resources. There's a lot of potential there for a very positive relationship with the U.S. Beyond just the terrorism concerns that can arise from instability, there's an economic opportunity there that I think we should work to try and seize. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Affleck, Dr. Frazier, Mr. Carafano, I think you've all raised one central issue, and that is the lack of security among the population. And so right now we're relying upon the Congolese government to provide that security. In Afghanistan, we've had a questionable partner in the Karzai government, and that's been difficult. And we have a less than credible partner, I think, in the Congolese government. In Afghanistan, we've gone to this village stabilization operations to provide as an alternative way to provide security at the local level within villages, within communities, whereby we've been providing some arms and some training to the local population there so that they can provide their own security. Obviously, the Karzai government is opposed, has been opposed to that. Are there any opportunities for any alternative strategies, given the nature of the Congolese government in the DRC? Mr. Affleck.
Well, I will in a second just yield to expert fellow panelists here. But one of the things that I think the basic issue, and a really simple issue, and one that would go a long way, and I alluded to earlier, is applying some influence to to President Kabila so that payment is made to his troops. I think that if there's one fell swoop, one stroke that would dramatically improve people's lives off the bat, that would be it. And that would do a sort of that would take a wholesale step towards improving the security sector. But as we talk about security sector as if it's this kind of mammoth thing, and on one level it is, but on another level, if you had paid soldiers who had any incentive to fight, for example, you wouldn't have a major capital overrun and taken over by 1,200 guys. I mean, that's half the size of the kids at my high school. That shows you the degree to which the federal government, in effect, is unable to exert control, even the smallest amount of control in the East. And I think that issue goes hand in glove with security sector reform. And then I'll
go Dr. Frazier and then Mr. Carafano.
I'll be very brief. This actually, working in training and local communities for self-protection was actually done in Rwanda. Against the FDLR. I'm not so sure about doing this in Congo. It's attractive to me, but I guess I would say it depends on the community. And I also would say that I think that the key here, again, is really to engage and embrace the Congolese government at the most senior level, but not just at the presidential level, but even at the ministerial level, which is why I keep talking about some type of binational commission, because then I think you can start penetrating those ministries which have the responsibility, even bring governors over so that you can deal at the provincial level. But I guess I think that the real heavy lift here is more on the diplomatic side and working very, very carefully with the Congolese government, which is essentially isolated and doesn't have very much contact, frankly, with our officials at this point in time.
Mr. Carafano.
So I remember about an army that wasn't paid, and the government reneged on all its promises. And when the American Revolution ended, the Continental Army went home. That says an awful lot about the nature and the character of the society. And I think that we all agree is if you have a security solution that doesn't fit with the situation on the ground and the people on the ground, it's simply not going to work. I'm sorry, I'm very skeptical that the government in Kinshasa is ever going to be a force for good in resolving this. But on the other hand, I totally agree with Mr. Affleck and Dr. Fraser. This is a country of great people, and if we can enable them to take control of their own lives, I think we'll see constructive. That's why I'm much more optimistic about solutions at the provincial level. But.
Very well. Mr. West from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the panel for being here. And I'm going to try to draw on, what I saw my year in Iraq and 2.5 years in Afghanistan. I see this kind of how do you put together a train? And too often what we do, we put a caboose before the engine, and then we have the train wreck, and then we come back and say, why did it happen? Because we never figure out what comes first, the secure environment, or does it the legitimate governance, or does the individual, the military education and training? So what I would like to ask you all, knowing what is the situation on the ground with Congo, and I do agree that you have to start at the provincial and the district level. I mean, we kind of learned that lesson late in Afghanistan because, that's the basis of that culture. Which is the right model to go with here? Because, Mr. Affleck, you talked about 27 different militia type of groups. So even if you try to have the governance corrected, if the militia groups are still running around, they continue to delegitimize the efforts that you're doing at the government, which is exactly what we saw in Afghanistan, where we tried to focus on Kabul, and Kabul doesn't extend out beyond the city limits. So as we build this train in the Congo, which would you all recommend to come first in order for us to be on the track to success?
I would just start that, if you get the international security assistance piece right, and you had African nations, including Uganda and Rwanda participating in it, then I think that gives you some breathing space to move on. So to me, that's the essential thing that's got to happen first.
I guess I would say that, one, I understand the premise, but I believe you can do both at the same time. I think you have to deal with governance, but obviously it's, creating greater security for the population.
Governance at which level?
At all levels, but you cannot, I don't think, frankly, do real governance at the provincial level with governors unless you're dealing with the capital because of the nature of the Congolese government and how it works. That said, I think that you start where you are, and you have MONUSCO, you have this force that is of no real effectiveness. Try to bring in units or create a new unit within it that has that capacity. And so I guess I would say that you definitely need, I guess I would put if I were forced to make a choice, I would, and I was dealing at the provincial level, their only force that is out there right now is MONUSCO. So I would try to bring into MONUSCO units that are actually capable. What I'll say is it's ironic to me to hear the Somali model presented as a success because that is something that has taken years to get to the point where it is. And it's going to be the same thing in Congo. And we never said, well, we can't deal with the transitional federal government at the same time that we're dealing with AMISOM. We had to do them together. Recognizing that it was going to take a long time, there were going to be casualties on the ground, and we were going to learn as we went. And I think that it's really getting in there and working without putting our forces at real risk that's going to be necessary. And so I've also, I would just say, add to that is, I've actually worked with the national government, and it's not as hopeless as it's being presented here either. It's obviously needs a lot of work, but you deal with who you're dealing with.
I did not have the honor to serve in our armed forces, and I did not have the opportunity to go to Afghanistan and Iraq, so I'm speaking from secondhand experience. But the sense that I get was that the United States government and the United States armed forces successfully trained troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. both under circumstances where very much unlike DRC, where they were doing so under hostile circumstances. Folks who were sometimes, and some folks who turned out to be hostile to the United States, and there was a situation of violence and lives were lost. What that tells me is that it's doable. It's a doable thing because the United States has done it. And not perfectly, not with that, you know, but it was done. Now, I'm not suggesting that we spend the kind of money that took. But I am pointing to that in a much more difficult situation, this goal was achieved. Now, I don't think it should be the United States that steps in and reforms the 100,000+ FARDC military. I do think it's a job for a multinational force. I think is a good idea. It may be a good job for NATO. It is the step, I believe, that will go the furthest, the quickest, in changing the quality of life for people and eliminating the 27 armed groups that you talk about. You're going to find it much more difficult to operate when they feel as though there's a force present that they are not equal to. And all of a sudden, people aren't going to want to take Goma, and people aren't going to believe that they can achieve political goals through violent means, because there is an active state security force that prevents that kind of thing from happening. So it happens in developed countries when people turn to the ballot box. I can't speak to the exact model of how that would work because I'm not qualified to, but I can speak to the fact that it's possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. West. Mr. McIntyre.
Thank you,
North
Mr.
Carolina.
Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses for coming today. Mr. Affleck, you mentioned in your testimony about how AFRICOM's work with the Congolese Army is demonstrating that, as you said, a little training can have a big impact, and you gave the incident about the car being stuck. ECI obviously has a great impression of that presence of U.S. forces and working with AFRICOM in helping in the ways that we have been able to help. Do you feel like the perception of the U.S. by the people themselves, the Congolese, is a positive one for the presence we have in training and working with their forces?
Yeah, I do, for the most part. You know, I mean, you have a big country, and it's got, you know, so there are a number of different competing opinions about it, you know, and different candidates, not unlike the way we are here. However, I would say that primarily, I'll give you an anecdotal example. I was asked to shoot a film for the UN, and I went into a bunch of refugee camps. It was about refugees. And this was during the fighting, and the earlier fighting when the previous version of M23, which was called the CNDP, was being led by a guy named Laurent Nkunda, and they were making very similar advancements on Goma, so a lot of instability, a lot of fighting. And I was walking around with the camera with my big UN badge, and I was experiencing a lot of hostility from folks in the camp, and I was experiencing, you know, some real resentment to the point where I thought maybe it's not wise for me to be in here. And so I took off the UN badge. And then people asked me, where are you from? You know, and I said, oh, America, I'm American. And then all of a sudden, you know, among people who are really, really suffering at the bottom end of the pain ladder that was going on there, I was welcomed, you know, and treated quite nicely. Now, this is anecdotal. It's one incident, and it could be the only place that happened, and I don't use this as an opportunity to beat up the UN, who I do think, despite some of its failings, you know, also does do important work, you know, infrastructure work in particular in Africa and in Congo in specific. But it did show me that Americans were respected and held in some esteem.
Thank you very much. And your efforts to call on the U.S. and the administration for a special envoy, have those calls been received by anyone? Have you gotten any response yet from the administration?
I've been given the impression that this is under review.
Okay.
Which is government speak that I just learned.
Right, okay.
Very good.
Well, fair enough. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I know we